Canada is facing a strategic turning point as U.S. tariffs threaten to escalate bilateral trade tensions. The Trump administration's 25% tariffs on steel and 10% on aluminum in 2018 have significantly damaged the Canadian economy, with losses estimated up to $2.5 billion per year. Instead of accepting a unilateral imposition, Canada responded forcefully by imposing tariffs on strategic U.S. goods such as whiskey and steel products. In a context where the trade war shows no signs of cooling down and Washington's policies are increasingly unpredictable, Canada is clearly aware of the urgency of diversifying economic and defense relations. An important step in this strategy is the Defense Cooperation Agreement with Australia, in which the Joint Radar System plays a core role. With the ability to detect air targets at a distance of up to 3,000 km, this system helps Canada strengthen its surveillance and defense capabilities in the Arctic without having to rely on the U.S. In the context of increased Russian military activity and climate change changing the regional strategic balance, proactive control of airspace and territorial waters in the Arctic is a vital priority. Recognizing that Washington is no longer a reliable partner, Canada has expanded cooperation with the European Union and Southeast Asia, signing trade and defense agreements worth $7 billion since 2023. The Canadian government is taking drastic steps to protect national interests, minimize risk from erratic U.S. policies, and increase autonomy in the international arena. The Arctic is becoming a strategic focal point, not only because of its abundant resources, but also because of the risk of military confrontation with other powers, especially Russia. With increasing competition in the region, Canada is forced to improve its defense capabilities and establish a strong strategic posture to protect its sovereignty and long-term interests. As new maritime routes open and untapped resources become increasingly accessible, the Arctic will be not only an economic battlefield but also an international security front. In the future, the Canadian government will continue to promote surveillance and deterrence measures in the Arctic, ensuring that the country is not passive in the face of geopolitical fluctuations and strategic calculations of its opponents. Canada is taking drastic steps to reshape its defense and trade strategy amid growing global pressure. Strengthening international partnerships and enhancing defense infrastructure have become key to maintaining stability and securing Canada's strategic position in the Arctic. The defense contract with Australia not only reduces dependence on the U.S., but also sends a clear message that Canada is willing to find new partners to protect its national interests. This move could reshape Canada's foreign policy for years to come. This strategic change reflects a turning point in the way Canada approaches global partners, moving away from U.S. domination in economic and defense matters. This is not just a temporary adjustment, but a systemic shift that could affect the entire region. However, the U.S. did not accept this easily. On March 4, 2025, the U.S. government officially imposed a new tax rate of 25% on imports from Canada and Mexico, and increased the tax on energy imports from Canada to 10%. The move is claimed to be aimed at protecting the U.S. economy and limiting the flow of allegedly illegal goods from neighboring countries. But in reality, this is not a victory. Canada responded strongly. Just a few hours after the tariff policy took effect, Canada immediately responded strongly. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau announced that Canada would not accept being imposed and immediately imposed a 25% tax on $155 billion of goods imported from the U.S., targeting key economic sectors. Of this, $30 billion is taxed immediately, while the remaining $125 billion will take effect within 21 days. This is the strongest trade response in Canadian history. In Ontario, Premier Doug Ford retaliated by imposing a 25% tariff on electricity exports to the U.S., affecting 1.5 million households in New York, Michigan, and Minnesota, and warned of possible power cuts if the tariffs were not removed by April. Nova Scotia doubled tolls on U.S. trucks, and Manitoba banned U.S. consumer goods from the province's retail system. Newfoundland and Labrador cut business ties with American businesses, directing trade to Europe. Strong retaliation from Canada caused a domino effect. Within days, U.S. financial markets were in chaos. The Dow Jones Index dropped nearly 800 points. The S&P 500 and Nasdaq dropped 2%, erasing $3.6 trillion from the Wall Street market. The US auto industry was hit hard, with Ford and GM forecasting losses of $14 billion and $6 billion. The construction industry is reeling because of escalating raw material costs due to import taxes. The chaos in the financial markets caused US investors to panic, pouring money into treasury bonds, pushing yields down, a classic sign of economic recession. The question is, what will Washington do next? Will they roll back the tariffs to prevent further damage, or will they continue to push the trade war to new levels? Meanwhile, the global trend is witnessing a strong solidarity in the face of pressure from the US. From Mexico to Ukraine, countries are increasingly determined to protect their sovereignty and interests. Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum received 85% support from the people when fiercely protecting national interests. More than 35,000 Mexicans took to the streets to affirm that they do not accept outside imposition. In Canada, unity also reached unprecedented levels. Leaders from all three major parties, Liberal, Conservative, and NDP, united to defend sovereignty and oppose US trade sanctions. Former Prime Minister Jean Chrétien and new Prime Minister Mark Carney both spoke out strongly that Canada cannot be a pawn in Washington's strategy. In Europe, France, Germany, Italy, and smaller partners are forming a united front to deal with trade pressure from the US. These countries not only oppose Washington's policies, but also actively seek new partners to shape a more equitable global trade order. Ukraine is also a clear example of international solidarity. Under the leadership of President Volodymyr Zelensky, the country remains steadfast in the face of geopolitical challenges, while winning strong support from the international community. Ukraine's solidarity and resilience are clearly demonstrated by the increase in President Zelensky's approval rating to nearly 70%. The world is witnessing a restructuring of international relations, where countries are no longer easily succumb to political and economic pressure from the US. Canada, together with global partners, is shaping a future where sovereignty and freedom are no longer values that can be manipulated by a single power. The US government is facing a wave of strong reactions from the international community, largely stemming from the unilateral and confrontational policies of former President Donald Trump. Under Trump's leadership, Washington continuously alienated allies, imposed tough trade measures, and pursued inconsistent decisions, seriously damaging America's global position. The sudden imposition of tariffs on Canada and Mexico was not only a strategic mistake, but also caused a strong reaction. Canada immediately responded with 25% tariffs on $155 billion in US goods, targeting key economic sectors, including the defense industry. Meanwhile, Mexico has made long-term preparations, proactively diversifying trade relations by expanding cooperation with China and the EU, reducing dependence on the US market. These moves mark an important shift in the North American economic order, where longtime partners no longer accept being manipulated by erratic policies from Washington. Not stopping there, Canada is implementing a financial revolution to reduce its dependence on the USD. By promoting transactions in the euro and other currencies, Ottawa is gradually creating a more independent financial system, minimizing risks from economic fluctuations caused by US policies. This is a strong statement that Canada is no longer willing to let Washington determine its economic future. History has shown that great powers cannot forever impose their will on other countries without facing consequences. The rise of Canada and Mexico is clear evidence of a changing world, where the United States, under Trump's leadership, is no longer the absolute center of global economic and political power. Under the current administration, Canada and Mexico are gradually reducing their dependence on the US, creating strong impacts on international markets. If Canada succeeds in this strategy, the US cannot continue to maintain a conservative monetary policy, but must adjust to adapt to the new context. Mexico, with its bold fiscal policy, is boosting exports by maintaining a weak peso, making its goods more competitive in the global market, especially in the auto industry, parts manufacturing, and agriculture. Meanwhile, the US is still stuck in traditional economic thinking, lacking the necessary reforms to maintain its competitive position. Not stopping at the financial sector, Canada and Mexico also restructured their energy strategies. Canada, one of the world's largest oil producers, is gradually shifting its oil exports away from the US, while Mexico is also stepping up the introduction of gas into the international market. These changes not only challenge America's energy stability, but also affect industries that depend on energy prices, from autos to heavy manufacturing. Most notably, Canada took the strategic step of expanding the Trans Mountain Pipeline with an investment of more than $24 billion to increase transportation capacity to 890,000 barrels per day. The goal is to bring crude oil directly to Asia, especially China, instead of depending on the US. This move reflects a wise economic policy, breaking away from Washington's control and proactively building a strategic partnership with a rising power. Cooperation between Canada and China is not just commercial but also reshaping global power. As China increases investment in oil refining infrastructure and ports to receive Canadian oil, the geopolitical order is also strongly affected. The United States can no longer dictate policy the way it once did, but faces a more multipolar world where traditional allies are seeking independence and their own interests. This change puts the US in a situation where it is forced to adjust its energy strategy. The loss of cheap and stable oil sources from Canada will cause energy prices to increase, affecting the domestic industry. US policymakers must quickly find alternative partners or promote domestic production if they do not want to lose their position as a global energy superpower. While the current administration has not yet given a clear response, Canada is taking advantage of the opportunity to emerge as a new strategic partner in the global economic order. This could be a turning point in reshaping the international political and economic landscape, where America no longer maintains a monopoly but must adapt to a rapidly changing world.